Thank you so much for that welcome, and thank you for the organizers for giving me this great opportunity to share something that I really love, namely design and design to inspire. Now, as mentioned, I do work with Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, so really I'm going to speak to my strengths, and I want to speak to you more specifically about housing design. I'm really passionate about housing because when you think about our basic human needs, we've got food and shelter. So I take the opportunity to work in the housing field as a real responsibility. It's a high calling, whether it's the social, the technical, the economic, or the environmental aspects. It really touches all of these. So I'm going to take some time to talk to you about housing design to inspire, and hopefully I'll inspire you to engage in some sort of concrete action with respect to housing. After all, we all live in houses and purchase and use homes. I do want to start, though, with a little bit of a preamble and speak more generically about design and really ask a very basic question. How do we define design? We all interact with it on a daily basis. We buy things. We buy designs fashioned by other people, doers in the background who've made things, hopefully, to meet our needs. And in this sense, design is understood as a noun. It's an outcome. It's a thing that we purchase. And hopefully it's going to meet our needs. If we think of clothing design, hopefully, for instance, if you're buying a pair of shoes, they're not going to cause a footache or a backache. And hopefully it's going to meet our needs over time. Now, with some objects that are essentially throwaway objects or that have a very limited time span, basically, it's fine. They're going to go in the waste heap. Maybe they'll be repurposed or reused to some degree. So it's not too much of a problem if the design isn't as good as it ought to be. And really, the marketplace will dictate which products will proliferate and which will dwindle, because people simply won't buy those ones. It's much more important when we're looking at the design of our built environment. Housing, buildings, our cities, these things last a very long time. And if we don't design them appropriately to truly anticipate our needs, instead of serving our needs, they're going to constrain us and limit us, and limit really the potential that we have to dwell together and to meet our real potential as a society. Again, whether it's in the home or in the city at large. That's one way to look at design, something that you purchase or you inherit that's designed by other doers. Another way is to say, you know what? Design is a verb. It's an action. It's a process that we're actually actively engaged in. And today we're talking about what it means to be a true citizen. And really, I would say that design as a verb is really, when you're a citizen, is how you need to look at it. It's the right of being a citizen. It's also an obligation to be actively engaged and to be a participant in creating the world around us, to be making it and remaking it, shaping and reshaping it, forming it and reforming it. And certainly as participants here of this post-secondary institution, we've come here to learn, not just necessarily to get a job, but to be active participants in the world. So I really, truly challenge you to think of design as a verb and one that you are actively involved in. So building out that definition, it's really about creating to meet an intended purpose, or to fulfill an intention. And if we design effectively, we're going to end up with the result that we intended. So we wanted to design a comfortable chair. We designed a chair. It was comfortable. We met our needs. We may want to strive even further and look at what we might term exceptional design. So for a designer involved in this, that may lead to inspiration for them as the designer. And one thing about designing is what you find is you're designing and creating, but you're almost uncovering. It's almost like a historic relic that you're peeling back and finding that there was some hidden order. And it inspires you. You find this internal logic. So that's one way of inspiring. The other would be for the users. Have you ever lived in a home and you found that, yeah, it meets my needs, but over time you began to see other things as your needs changed, and this house actually anticipated them. Maybe it was a certain view corridor towards a beautiful vista because of a window, the way it was precisely located. Or maybe the fact that that house is so energy efficient and your operating costs are not going to help dwindle your resources, and you're able to make ends meet. Another way that design might inspire would really be for those people who are looking at your work in the future and seeing what you did. And when you study architectural history, really you're looking at the great masters. But before we go ahead and strive for this design to inspire, I want to say first things first. And what should our intention be? What should our goal be? What should the outcome be that we're looking at? And this is particularly important when we're looking at housing design, because again, houses last a long time, cities last a long time, 50, 100, 200, 300 years. And they involve the manipulation of huge amounts of resources, whether it's capital or human resources or the natural environment. So we need to not just think about today, but we need to look at the future as well. But how do we know what that future will look like? We don't have a crystal ball. And this is where the sustainability lens can be of some benefit. It helps us to divine what that future might be, because it's looking at things holistically and not in isolation, not silos, but it's looking at the people who need to be at the forefront in our thinking because we're trying to meet their needs. We're also looking at the economic aspects, the profit, and the planet, thinking about the environment and its carrying capacity. Let's look at this a little bit more closely within the context of housing design. And let's look first off at people. And one of the most startling facts that we need to deal with as designers, there was a recognition of the increase in seniors' population. In fact, by 2036, it's going to more than double. So it's increasing at a much greater rate than other age groups in our society. What's that going to mean? I could have shown you images of maybe recreation communities and seniors on bikes enjoying parks, and those would be equally valid. But what I have shown you here is something that's maybe a bit more realistic. With being a senior, there's also some loss of mobility and the need for technological assists, things that people will design that will help seniors live with dignity and stay in their homes. So whether it's a cane or a pair of reading glasses or other technologies not yet even invented, we need to think about those. And all told, we need to think about housing that's much more accessible. Let's now look at the profit side, or the economics. And the fact that the average house price in Canada has more than doubled in the last 12 years. And in certain centers like Toronto and Vancouver, it's spiked even more incredibly. So it's a huge challenge. How can households that are just forming ever hope to rent or buy a home? So we need to get creative about how we develop our housing. Yes, we want our houses to increase in value because that builds wealth. But on the other hand, how do you do it in a way that it still allows new people to enter into the market? So that speaks to the need for affordable housing. Lastly, we'll look at the planet and the environment and the sheer fact of climate change and how it's affecting how we will build buildings in the future. Certainly we want to continue to build buildings that are energy efficient so they don't exacerbate the problem and add more carbon. But the fact is, climate change is here, and we're going to expect more and more severe weather events that are changing the service environment within which the buildings we designed even 50 years ago will have to operate. So as we think of new buildings, we need to think of how they can be that much more resilient. And here's a classic example, this image showing one weather event washing out in 2005, Finch Avenue, and leading to about a $500 million, over $500 million insurance claim. Now, as a designer, do you want to be party to a project like that wasn't sufficiently resilient to withstand one weather event? And when this happened, many, many houses were also affected with basement flooding and all sorts of things. So we need to think of more resilient housing. So bringing this all together, accessible, affordable, and resilient housing, and maybe resilient sums it up, because resilient means it's going to be accessible and it's going to anticipate the changing needs of the users. It's also going to anticipate the changing financial situation. Let's now look at an example to make this a little bit more real. And I'm using an example that's maybe an unlikely one. It's a pretty basic house. It's a typical post-World War II bungalow. Many of you maybe have lived in one of these, or your grandparents live in one, or you live adjacent to one. They're all over the country. And it's really a great house. It was built really right after World War II, returning war vets, new homes being formed, young families, and was able to meet the needs of many and continued to do so to this day. Many people are finding this to be their first home that they purchase. And it's accessible, affordable, and reasonably resilient. There is some room for improvement, though, if we look at it with the scale, the Energuide scale, which is what we use in Canada to assess the energy efficiency of a home, 0 being really poor and 100 being spectacular. This house sits at around 48, somewhere between 0 and 50. So it means it's not very energy efficient. There's some room for improvement. So one group of designers, a group called Work Worth Doing, took this on as an opportunity, and they came up with an initiative and coined a phrase, the initiative called Now House, and the phrase called One Small Home, 1 Million Opportunities. And they thought, if we can address this little problem and encourage and enable other people, we could sweep the country and make a difference. And they were supported by CMHC through a competition we had called an Equilibrium competition to create sustainable houses across the country. So they set out to do their work. First, they took the existing walls and removed the old skin, the old cladding. They added a new wall outboard, complete with additional insulation and increased air tightness. They likewise did that to the roof rafters. And then they began to look at the outside, adding new cladding, new high-efficiency windows. They added renewable technologies because they reduced their energy needs so much that now they could find that sweet spot where they could simply rely on the sun to heat their hot water. Or in the case of Ontario, where we have a feed-in tariff program, they were able to add PVs to the roof and turn that roof into a revenue generator, selling electricity to the grid. They also looked inside the house and made sure that all of the materials they use were low tox, not adding toxicity or odors or pollutants to the space to make it as healthy as possible. And with all of this effort, they did something incredible. They moved that house on the scale from 48 to 94. That's an incredible feat when you consider January of this year, the building code dictated that all new homes would be built at 80. And this thing has already far surpassed it, showing us what we can do. Now, building on this, they decided to go out to Windsor and work with the social housing provider who had a number of these houses under their care. And they took 5 such houses and they began to do the very same thing, each one migrating from a very low rating to a higher rating. And you can see the numbers there. And collectively, they went from about 38 on average to about 78. So these houses are that much more affordable and resilient and truly are meeting the needs for this future generation. And they're truly addressing these fundamental needs, as mentioned, accessible housing, affordable housing, and resilient housing. Now, you might say that, well, you know, housing, it's a great topic, and it's certainly something that's for all those doers, and there are people here at Seneca who are involved in the construction side, and that's for those folks. But I want to encourage you all to consider how you might be involved in this, because housing truly touches everyone. We're all going to buy a house at some point. We may be living in a home right now that we own. We may be also helping to maintain a home that our parents live in. Or we may be young people living in our parents' home. We're all involved in this. But think of also the very long supply chain for housing, the manufacturers of products and materials, certainly the designers and constructors. How about all those at the other end of the chain who sell these houses? The appraisers, the lenders, the realtors, the home inspectors. There's so many people that could be touched by this. So I want to encourage you to consider what your role might be with respect to housing. And also consider that design is not just a noun. It's not something you buy off the shelf. Design is truly a verb that, as citizens, you ought to be engaged in. So I want to encourage you to think of how you might design to inspire, whether it's housing or any other thing that you touch and that you affect through positive and concrete actions. So with that, I just want to encourage you to go ahead and design to inspire. Thank you very much.